Welcome to Rauta's Worst to Best video. Now, today I'm gonna talk you about a band called Absu, which just called it quits earlier this year. Originally, I was actually gonna make this earlier, already in the first couple of months, but you know how things are, and suddenly I was waiting for some news. Now, the thing which got me inspired basically was this. Last November, I was in Scotland seeing for shows at Darkness Guides as 2019, and there was Zemial playing where I got to talk not only the Zemial main man was Scarf, but also Proscriptor, who is also part of Absu. I mean, Absu is basically nowadays his band, or was, but he was also doing vocals for Zemial. So I got to do this kind of a Zemial and Absu interview at the same time. Well, it was Zemial, but Absu was already mentioned as well. And back then I was told that a new Absu album was going to get out early 2020. And only basically a few weeks after all that chat and cool things and, promises that new Absu album would be very interesting and all that stuff, suddenly I was reading news, Absu is no more. Absu call it a day and that's it. And obviously I was anxiously waiting for some news to happen, like what was going on and stuff like that. And I was basically told just wait and see. Now it's already early May and I'm still kind of waiting and seeing what's going to happen. But it seems like Absu is not coming back. I don't know if the music is just popping out later on under some new moniker or whatever. But that kind of gave me the reason to kind of get a little bit of a recap of Absu history. And why so? Because I think Absu is one of the best, if not the best, American black metal band of all times. Now, Absu's discography is not the biggest one out there, especially considering how much the band has actually achieved during those years and how many years that they have been in the game. But still, I thought, hey, if ever there is now time to talk to you about a little bit Absu discography. So here it goes. Let's just tune for Metal Archive site for Absu so you get the idea what there is or has been throughout all these years. Now, I got to know Absu, I think it was pretty much late 90s. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember that first I wasn't so much into Absu, and later on I kind of clicked it with totally like that. It was like magic, like a different band suddenly struck my head with a lightning bolt or something, and then I really found it. And since that I have had this kind of a passion for Absu, but certain things just don't change, obviously, because some albums you either like or you don't, and you don't necessarily learn to like the music. Even though there is this old saying among critics that you might just listen to album enough of times to make it actually worthwhile, that is kind of a likable. So even though you don't initially like a certain album, after dozens of spins you might eventually kind of grow onto that. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about me here. I'm going to talk to you about Absu and why I think certain albums are better than the rest and in which order I would put them in my personal view. I mean, what would be my worst to best order for Absu. Now, first, before we get into the actual order of the albums, you have to understand that like so many other bands which have been there like 3 decades, Absu also has changed a lot during those time. So it's not a big surprise that you might see genre mentioned like here. For example, here it says early Absu being death metal, then kind of a black thrash metal. But despite the musical changes throughout the Absu scores, I think pretty much the same ideas have been carried along on the path of Absu, and that he's been these topics such as mythology, occultism, and so forth. And Absu has never been just like everybody's generic black metal band. It has never been like this G.I. Joe kind of a black metal band that everybody just gets into. It's so much more bizarre, so much more occult, and so much just plain weird that most black metal bands seem like kids' hobbies compared to what Absu is doing. And that goes both in good and bad. I mean, black metal has always been about the secrecy of the occult, the unknown art, what lies beyond, that is both beyond death, beyond our existence, beyond gods, Satan and all. But obviously some bands are just more straightforward and more grounded to the normal life, so-called normal life anyway. But Absu has been always like one of those like mystic cases. It's not just, ready to be revealed as like, okay, we're just guys who play black metal. It's not that. Absu is something way more fascinating, and I think it can be weird enough to just to be this too weird kid for some people in the scene. Now, anyway, that's a long intro to Absu, which is, like said, one of my favorite black metal bands of United States of America. And the curious thing is, they are from Texas. Probably the least state in the whole country that I would expect one of the most mystical, most occult black metal band ever to emerge. I mean, maybe California and places like that, or some of those southern states such as like South Carolina, whatever. But still, Texas with all its cowboy boots and, the kind of a cowboy culture, big cars, great distances between places, prairie and all that stuff. And then there's Absu. Because so many people kind of put black metal into Nordic areas, Norway especially, but also Sweden, Finland, Iceland, in general speaking, Nordic countries. So basically cold places, dark places, not places with, cowboys and big ass pickups, ranches and all that stuff. But that's where Absu is coming from, and that makes it even more intriguing how this band came to be and how unfortunately it ceased to be. But here you go, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about worst to best of Absu. Now, if we scroll this discography here on Metal Archives a bit, you can pretty much see how Absu started with Absu name, actually. You can see these previous names. Earlier in 1991. So, like so many old bands, first there were demos. Not just your full-length album straight away like that, but more about doing demos. EPs and stuff like that. And then finally, after a couple of years, progressed into an album called Baratrum Vitriol with those dots. And later on, the pace kind of picked up and they turned more into albums until when we kind of finally reached the 2000s and so forth. And you can pretty much notice it's more about compilations and splits and singles rather than full albums. But where would we start if, in my opinion, we had to pick the worst of Absu, and why? Well, in fact, I would actually go all the way back to the first album, Baratrum Vitriol, which is actually the only death metal album by the band. And now you have to understand this is very, very different album from the rest of Absu, because while the band certainly has its roots right here, being kind of a technical, especially the drums. The drums are the foundation of Absu in so many ways. The thing here is, it kind of shows that these guys were doing other bands before progressing into Absu and later on into black metal. But Baratrum Vitriol is kind of like kind of experimental death metal. It's too weird to be your average death metal band, even from the United States of America. But still, it's not really black metal. It is something that is kind of like beyond those borders or between certain basic genres. So I think it was, in essence, what the demo is to a band, what the first album is to a whole band in a kind of a bigger scale. Think about when Darkthrone started with their death metal album and then progressed to black metal. This is basically the same stuff that happened with Absu, only a few years later, but still. And I know there are lots of people who actually think that this album is the best of Absu, but obviously we talk different language, because for me Absu is mostly about this black metal band which has a death metal album in their discography, not vice versa. So it depends which background you're coming from, I guess. But for me, Baritone Vitriol is not really average album, but it's kind of a mediocre, because while it has these kind of crazy ideas which later on evolved into something different, in my opinion it's not really fascinating, apart from the drumming, which is just great already there, and trust me, it only got better later on. So that would be the worst of Absu. Not a bad album, but kind of a mediocre. Now, curiously enough, the second, in my opinion, the second worst, or second bad album would be The Son of Tippereth. Now, with this album coming out 2 years later, the style is already black metal. It's kind of experimental, a little bit maybe technical, but it's not like that simple. But it's clearly like a different band, much like, once again, with Darkthrone. Once progress from Soulside Journey to A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Absu did basically the same kind of shape-shifting. You know, it was that metal band at once, and on the second turn, it's already some black metal, and it's evolving, it's changing its chords and stuff like that. Now these guys are kind of learning how to do black metal riffs and all that stuff. And still, it has this kind of same mystical, occult stuff, but the music is different. But in my opinion, not too shabby an album. I mean, it's quite nice and all, but even if after so many years when I was listening prior to making this video, I was pretty much like, yeah, I still remember why I don't like this album too much. It's very listenable, it's somewhat enjoyable, but it kind of lacks the magic what Absu was to be later on. Now, fast forward 2 years more, and we have the third storm of Sythraul. I don't actually know how to pronounce it, but let's call it Sythraul. Anyway, this basically continues with the same ideas as Tippereth, but maybe kind of a more trashy. It seems like the band is now solidified with the idea what they're doing. So their own black metal is kind of shaping up even more. And this Absu sound, Absu feeling is right there already. Now you know that the first album was experimenting with death metal. The second album was maybe sort of a lucky strike or something. But with the third album, you know that now they actually know what their style is. They're not guessing anymore, like whether or not the second album would be something else, and maybe third album once again something else. Now they clearly have a kind of a direction where they're going. But still, this is something that, while I think it's a little bit better than Tippereth, it's still something like, something magical is still missing. And after that, everything kind of changed. And for me, it was this EP only a year later called In the Eyes of Ildnach. Now, if you know my previous First to Best, I don't usually mention EPs because I just want to stick with the albums. But what I want to mention is that for me, this was a game changer. This was the release which just got me to fall in love with Absu. But now I'll jump a few years, because the next in line wouldn't be the fourth album called Tara, but actually the last album to be Absu with Z. As you might notice already, within 2 years there was Absu with S, Absu, and then Absu. I don't know actually why I decided to go this way, but hey, I'm not in charge of the names. Now, Absu is very much in the same different era kind of Absu, what basically this In the Eyes of Ildnach started. So it's the kind of what I would call third wave of Absu. If the Baritone Vitriol was the first one, and then came the second one, this would be the so-called third era in my opinion. And while Absu is, I think, quite a notch up from Sythraul, I think it's also a little bit different in terms of, not only because of the years past obviously, but because the songwriting is different, and this is also the reason that you might notice some change line up. And as you can see, Proscriptor McGovern is the only one who basically was there all the time. But if you take a look at the past members, well, there are quite a few, But most important ones, I guess, were Shaftiel, who left in 2002, and also Equitant, who also left 2002. So these guys from 1991 to 2002, the main guys who basically shaped Absu to be throughout the course. But since 2002, it was a different band because these guys just, well, they were gone. And as you can notice, the newer lineup, it kind of was changing throughout the course. So it was more about just Proscriptor to keep going, you know. And I think obviously that kind of reflects with the discography here, because after Tara was done, these two main guys were just gone. Shaftiel and Equitant were no more with Absu and Absu. And while Absu is pretty much like a brother to Absu, this wordplay makes me crazy. It's not as consistent in songwriting. The quality is a little bit more shady. It's more like not so well balanced. I mean, it's good, but it also has these lesser moments. For example, this last track, A Song for Ria, which is also somewhere listed as a kind of a medley. This is kind of a too much to be chewed, you know, because it changes its style. It's like a vortex of song versus the rest of here. So it isn't as well structured as the previous one, which I would call Absu. So that would be my fourth in the list. And now the question is, so which one is better? Which one is the best Absu album, if not Absu or the previous ones, you know, albums from 1 to 3? Now, I would say Absu is the second best album by Absu. And the reason is this. It's very much like Tara, but not as good songs here. And while this is definitely a bit better than Absu, it also makes the, you know, kind of shows the lack of these guys, Shaftiel and Equitant, because, you know, it is just trying to pick the pieces right after Tara, which is just so fierce and intense and incredible, magical album. And while there are killer tracks such as Amy, if you need to listen to just one song on this album, you know, and you don't have anything, know what to expect, just pick Amy. It's really, really good. But I mean, even this album is like almost an hour. It's still very strong overall. I know the production and all that stuff, and the crazy drums played by Proscriptor, they are all there. But this is not as fierce and is intense and crazy and just superb genius album what Tara was. So now that you know my order, I could say Absu is like a letter V turned upside down. It starts from here to kind of get this incline and then turns into decline. So I don't know if after Absu would be even, you know, once again going to the wrong direction, the worst direction. I don't know, maybe they quit at the right time. Well, joking aside, I think something was lost after Tara and because of these two guys. But then again, still I think Absu and Absu are better than the three first ones. So it gets kind of interesting how the band was shaping and progressing and evolving all the time. But now this album, Tara, this is something really crazy. And once again, this is 52 minutes long an album, and with this intensity that the album actually bears, well, it makes one really exhausted. The intensity is just on another level compared to most other black metal bands ever made. Just the sheer drum work is just astounding. It's so brilliant. It's so unique. It's definitely one of a kind thing. But it's not only the drums, obviously, because drums don't make riffs. Drums don't make melodies or chorus parts. So what we in essence have here, in my opinion, is one of the best black metal albums of all time, hands down. Because everything here is just genius work. Riffs, production, drums. Well, if I had to mention a kind of a weak part. That would be vocals. Because as much as I like what Proscriptor and the rest of the crew made here, well, vocals never were the best part of Absu. I mean, nothing really to be bitchy about it. I don't want to complain about them. But let's be honest about it. And this you can especially hear with Absu and Absu later on. They are not that great. I mean, it's kind of a basic black metal shriekiness with just some random high-pitched screams which are said to be by some other guy, which I won't mention. You have to guess that yourself or do a little bit Googling, because it's not ever been officially, I think, mentioned. Anyway, the point aside is, the vocals are not that too shabby. I mean, they do their job and they're just fine there, but the rest is just superior. In my opinion, Tara beats like 99% of black metal albums easily. One hand tied behind its back. Because it's just so crazy brilliant. All the different little details on the album. Be it about drums, be it about riffs, be it about the speed, how the album goes back and forth. It's like Slayer on speed, you know. Being drugs, it's kind of a trashy, and yet at the same time it doesn't really sound like a trash black album. So I don't really agree with Absu being labeled as trash black, because I mean, our noir is kind of a trash black. And while Absu has a certain level of trashiness in its songs, I think it's just something different. Or maybe we're talking about this kind of a Voivod meets black metal, kind of a weird, unique black trash thing to understand it. It's not like, you know, Anthrax and black metal or Slayer and black metal kind of a thing. It's just something different. Not too trashy, even though the DNA might be just here and there splattered all over. But my point is, Tara is just a stunning album. It's majestic, it's crazy, and can I say one more time, intense. That's the word I think labels the album more than anything. So with this relatively short discography, I mean 6 albums in roughly 30 years. What can I say? 3 really good ones, 3 not so good ones, and still it's one of my favorite black metal bands from United States of America. And I think it's a lot to thank for Tara and In the Eyes of Eotnak for those reasons, but also Absu and Absu. So really great band. So in case you have somehow missed Absu during its existence, now it's time to correct your mistakes and give Absu another chance. Brilliant band, and too bad it's now gone. But with this feel-good video, I hope that you will catch up with Absu and dive into its discography, because it really is worth it. Anyway, thank you for watching. Should you have any comments, opinions, whatever, put them on the comments box below and I'll get back to you. See you and take care.